So Ember has received an heirloom skin, and with her coming into the Prime Resurgence as well as the little rework that happened in the Jade Shadows update, I feel like it's time for me to make an Ember guide, as I can imagine a lot of people are actually playing her now. Now, I have dabbled a bit with her before, but after coming back to her with her changes, wow, she is actually in a really good position in my opinion. I actually kind of enjoy her playstyle, and I think some of you will enjoy her very active and aggressive playstyle. She has some really fun synergies with her abilities and playstyles, so we're going to go over everything Ember in this video. Let's talk about her abilities, and of course her passive is first. Ember gains 5% extra ability strength for every enemy burning with an active heat status effect within 50 meters. This doesn't have a cap as far as I know, as I've gone above the 130% before, which is a lot of enemies that are affected. This buff will be shown above Imulation's heat gauge on the right. Fireball is Ember's first ability. You will throw out a fireball that will inflict heat on enemies with a 100% status chance. The projectile will explode within a radius of 3 meters and will apply heat to any nearby enemy affected. You can cast fireballs in rapid succession to perform a repeating combo chain. Each hit in the chain deals increasing damage by 2 times up to an 8 times combo. Personally, Fireball is more of a primer. It's not actually good for killing enemies unless they are armor stripped from her third ability, which I'll go over in a second. And I mean, this is Archon Vitality with over 200% strength, the raw damage without armor stripping. If you have her second ability up and cast Fireball, the combo will go up to 12 times instead of 8 times. Fireball has an augment called Fireball Frenzy. If you hold to cast Fireball, you gain 100% heat damage to you and your allies' attacks for 40 seconds. The damage will be scaled by strength and the duration will be scaled by ability duration. This augment is particularly good if you want to make up an element on your weapon and you don't want to mod for it on the actual weapon. You can just use this augment to get heat. Another cool thing about Ember is you can make use of her passive by priming a bunch of enemies nearby with heat, get that extra 50-60% strength or even more, and then cast Fireball Frenzy to get a big strength boost, ultimately giving you more heat damage. Now, Fireball actually synergizes with her second ability, which is called Imulation. Imulation is Ember's defensive ability. Protect yourself with a swirling flame that burns stronger over time. While Imulation is active, a thermometer will be shown at the bottom right above your abilities or a heat gauge, whichever one. You will start at 40% damage reduction, and as you scale in temperature, the damage reduction will scale with the heat gauge. If you scale strength, the damage reduction will cap at 90%. When you reach max temperature, Imulation will drain 4 energy per second. After 30 seconds at max heat, Imulation will then drain 12 energy per second. But this won't be a problem as you will be refreshing this consistently with your third ability. So this is what keeps Ember alive. Now this ability is the core focus of Ember's kit, as all of her other abilities will directly affect Imulation and its temperature gauge, and on the flip side, Imulation will also affect how her other abilities work as well. When you cast Imulation, the bar will passively fill at a rate of 0.5% per second. Each cast of her first ability Fireball will increase the rate of heat generation by 1% per second. Her third ability Fire Blast, which I haven't gone over yet, but when you cast it, it will decrease the rate of heat generation by 2% per second, which is not good, and it will remove 50% of the heat bar, which is also not very good, but it helps you to regulate the max temperature debuff. If you cast her fourth ability Inferno, it will increase the rate of heat generation by 3% per second. So Imulation is super important for Ember and synergizes incredibly well with her kit. Now let's talk about Imulation's augment called Immolated Radiance. Allies within affinity range will receive 50% of Immolation's damage reduction. It's actually 45%. I don't know why the mod says 50, but it's actually 45. It's kind of weird. This is more of a support augment, which I personally don't see worth putting on Ember, but it is a very niche one if you do want to use it for your friends or something like that, if you have any. Her third ability is called Fire Blast. Now, Fire Blast is pretty important. Slam the ground to create a wave of heat that knocks back enemies and armor strips them. Armor stripping is always welcome on any frame. Now, the armor stripping is directly affected by the Immolation's heat temperature. The armor stripping starts at 50% and moves up to 100% depending on the heat gauge. Fire Blast will also apply heat on enemies affected by the wave. When you cast it, it will decrease Immolation's rate by 2% per second, while also removing 50% heat levels from Immolation's gauge, which I just explained earlier on. So, Fire Blast removes the heat, while her first and fourth ability will increase the bar faster. When Immolation's heat levels are max, Fire Blast's energy cost will reduce to 25 energy, making it a little bit cheaper for you to cast. Fire Blast is also incredibly important as it is used to negate the effect of being at max heat for too long. So Fire Blast is very helpful to help you reset that heat gauge. Fire Blast has two augments, the first one being Healing Flame, which is a must-have in my opinion, as this makes Ember a lot better and a lot more tankier. Each enemy hit by Fire Blast heals you by 25 to 50 health, depending on the Immolation level. With Ember, any overhealing will be converted into Overguard. The amount healed and Overguard gained is affected by ability strength. This makes Ember a lot more tankier considering you're going to naturally be casting Fire Blast, and the status immunity from Overguard is always nice to have. The next one is Purifying Flames, which is actually a PvE and a Conclave mod which can be obtained from the Conclave or the Nightwave. Allies hit by the expanding ring of fire are cured of status effects and granted 4 seconds of status immunity. This is affected by ability duration. I personally have never used it, but I imagine being pretty decent as a support augment. Ember's fourth ability is called Inferno. You summon fiery meteorites that come from the sky crashing into all on-screen enemies in a 67-degree angle. On impact, enemies will take heat and impact damage, with 100% heat status chance. Enemies that are hit with the meteorite are surrounded by a ring of fire for 15 seconds, which will grow in a radius of 5 meters, dealing heat damage per second. Unaffected enemies who walk into this ring will then be affected by heat as well, and these enemies will have their own fresh duration of the heat damage over time. The ring radius growth is affected by ability duration and does not require line of sight. Inferno actually costs 0 energy to cast. If enemies are within range, it will consume 10 energy per enemy on screen. Energy is consumed at most for 10 targets for a total of 100 energy. And if you increase the efficiency, it just means that you will be able to target more targets to a total of 100 energy. So Inferno is actually really good to use when there are no enemies on your screen to build up your Immolation's heat levels, because it doesn't cost you any energy, and Inferno will raise Immolation's heat generation by 3% per second per cast. Inferno gains bonus damage in percentage equal to the current heat level of Immolation, dealing double damage at max heat. Inferno has an augment called Exothermic. Enemies killed while under the effect of Inferno have a 50% chance to drop an energy orb. This is actually a very good way to sustain your energy with Ember, as she is a caster frame and she burns through energy, which I will admit, it's not absolutely needed, but it is very handy to have, and you can even run a double augment like Healing Flame and Exothermic to make Ember quite comfortable to play. That pretty much concludes Ember's abilities and her augments. Before we go into how we actually play Ember, could I ask if you could take a second and just smash that like button, as it really helps me out with the algorithm. Thank you so much, you mighty fine tenor. Now, how do we actually play this frame? Well, I'm going to divide this part of the video into 2 sections. The first for a no helmet Ember playstyle, the second for a helmet playstyle for Ember. So let's talk about how to play Ember as her base frame with no helmet. In your general missions, you want to keep up your second ability, which is Imulation. Remember, her kit is heavily based around her Imulation. When you cast Imulation, you want to make use of your first ability Fireball or your fourth ability Inferno to build up your temperature gauge. Fireball isn't the best for damage, its main use is to proc heat on enemies, and so you can make use of your passive and also to build up your temperature gauge. However, Inferno is a bit better in that regard. Remember I explained earlier that if there are no enemies on your screen, Inferno will cost 0 energy to cast. Even if no enemies are affected by it, it will still apply the 3% heat generation per second from each cast of Inferno. So a very good tactic is casting Imulation, stare straight into a wall or completely look away from all enemies on your screen, spam Inferno multiple times to start building up your temperature gauge, then you can just turn around and cast Inferno on enemies. This will help you with your energy sustain, especially when you're trying to build up your energy if you are low. Then, as you go about your mission, you can cast Inferno or Fireball often to keep up your temperature gauge. This is the one slight downside of Ember. You are constantly trying to micromanage your heat bar the whole time. But I can say though, with a bit of practice, it will become second nature to you and you won't have to worry too much about your temperature bar, especially if you're spamming Inferno and casting Fire Blast to regulate the heat the whole time. Now, Fireball increases your heat generation by 1% per second. Inferno increases it by 3% per second. But her third ability, Fire Blast, will drop your total heat percentage by 50% and reduce the heat generation by 2% per cast. This is why Inferno is actually a lot better to cast than Fireball, as you can fight the constant battle between Fire Blast decrease versus the Inferno increase a lot better. The most important thing is keeping your heat at 90% as much as possible, but here comes the micromanaging. You have to make sure that you don't stay at 90% for too long, because if you do, your energy will start to drain considerably. So Fire Blast is your reset. However, I have noticed that you'll be spamming Fire Blast regardless to armor strip your enemies, and if you're using her augment Healing Flame, you will be spamming it to keep yourself alive more. There are very few moments with Ember that you will actually be stuck at 90% for longer than 30 seconds. If you are running augments on Ember, I would personally suggest the exothermic augment for her 4th ability. This will drastically improve your energy sustain with her, as Ember is inherently a caster frame, meaning you'll be spamming abilities all the time. Now, the beautiful thing about exothermic and Inferno is, technically speaking, you can cast Inferno once in a mission or a few times in a mission, and it will constantly reset. This is of course if you are, let's say, playing a survival solo. In this instance, not if you're playing in a group, because your allies will be killing groups of enemies and stuff like that, so it's a different scenario then. Like I explained earlier on in the ability section, when you cast Inferno, it will affect the enemies with a swirl of flames, and that little swirl will slowly grow. If another enemy walks into that swirl, it will also be affected by Inferno, and it will create its own swirl and refresh the duration. This will happen independently from the first cast. So effectively, if enemies keep walking in, it will just keep spreading to new enemies, and it will constantly reset the timer every time a new enemy is affected. This is where having a grouping ability on Ember through the Nautilus would make your life a lot easier and work incredibly well with her. So a bunch of enemies will be primed by Inferno, and with the exothermic augment they have a 15% chance to drop an energy orb, which of course means better energy sustain. You do obviously want to constantly cast Inferno, as it helps with the heat generation, and it's also a really good CC ability to stagger your enemies. The next augment I would suggest is Healing Flame for the Overguard. With the amount of CC and extra Overguard with Ember, it is super nice to have that extra layer of defense. If you are shield gating with Ember or running a tank setup, you can use the Fireball Frenzy augment to become a good weapons platform. The other two augments are more support augments, which is entirely up to you if you want to use that. Ember is actually incredibly versatile. She can be used as a weapons platform, a full-on tank, a nuke frame, or simply just a hybrid. The nice thing about Ember is that her passive allows you to gain a free 50 to 100% strength depending on how many enemies will be affected by heat. This is steelpath enemy density though. It is a range that I'm giving. It's not always like this, it's just an example. But if you're generally a steelpath player, you'll be affecting a lot of enemies with heat, and it really helps Ember. My point is, her passive is actually incredibly useful and helps when building Ember for certain things, as you get a bunch of strength for free. Now, how do we build Ember with no helmets? Well, generally speaking, with Ember, you want some strength and duration. Some range if you want to, although this is personal preference, yours may differ. Ember's 3rd and 4th ability have a 25 meter radius at base 100% range, which is honestly not too bad. I personally find that it's fine, considering most tile sets force enemies to be relatively close to you, so 25 meters is more than enough. If you feel like that's too short, then be sure to add either Augur Reach or Stretch into your build. As a simple build template, you can run a dual augment setup, making use of Exothermic, Fireball Frenzy, or Healing Flame depending on if you want to be tankier, Transient Fortitude, Continuity, Rolling Guard as an insurance policy, Stretch for a bit more range. However, I will say though, if you have Archon Vitality, I would personally use this over Stretch, as Archon Vitality will double your heat procs from Ember's abilities, which means you will ultimately do more damage with her. Flow and Equilibrium for energy sustain. In the Aura slot, you can go Brief Respite or Growing Power. Exilus is entirely up to you. When it comes to the arcanes to run with Ember, I would suggest running Augmented for that extra strength, because why not? Efficiency for more duration, Energize if you have it for energy sustain, Arcane Aegis for extra tankiness, Eruption for CC, or you can use Consequence for quality of life and faster movement. Otherwise, you can switch this around to what you like or what you simply have available. Now, this is a shield gating setup that focuses on Brief Respite to keep you alive, but I do know some of you don't like shield gating. So you can do a health tanking setup. This consists of you using Adaptation instead of Rolling Guard, Arcane Blessing, and Arcane Reaper or Arcane Guardian. Running a health mod like a maxed out Archon Vitality will help Ember drastically because all of her abilities apply heat. Or there is another tanking setup for Ember if you prefer something different. Making use of Quick Thinking, Hunter Adrenaline to sustain your energy, Arcane Blessing and Arcane Grace is a decent way to keep Ember alive. This is what the build would look like if you used Quick Thinking. It's something different for those of you who don't want to rely on normal tanking setups. Now there is another tanking setup which I want to go over later on in the video, but it will require a helmet. That pretty much concludes all the non-helmet builds and how to play Ember with just her base kit. Please, I want to make this very clear. This applies to the no helmet or the helmet version. You guys, please change the build to what you have available, and especially if you are a beginner watching this who doesn't have all these fancy mods that I've shown, just use what you have available. Here is a nice, simple, low forma build if you just want to try out Ember and not have to invest too much into her. This is what you can use as a basic build. I'm super interested to hear what builds you guys are running with Ember, so please comment down below certain synergies or something like that, and maybe I can take a look at them in game. Now let's actually move on to some helmet setups with her. The first one we have is the nuking setup, focusing on Ember's 4th ability. This is my favorite build for Ember at the moment. Here we subsume Raw over your 1st ability. This is to help boost the damage from Inferno drastically, especially since its heat procs being applied onto enemies. That means its damage over time, and Raw double dips that. We then make use of Archon Vitality to double up those heat procs on each cast, which means more damage. Remember, Inferno's damage is doubled when you reach max temperature with Imulation, which means even more damage scaling. The nice thing about having Raw on is you can time your cast with Ember's passive. When you reach, let's say, 100% extra strength from your passive, you can quickly cast Raw to increase the strength of it. We then make use of Exothermic to sustain our energy better and Heating Flame to survive more. This is what the build looks like. When it comes to the arcanes, you can use Augmented and Aegis. If you find that you're still running out of energy, you can use Energize if you want. I'm just a chronic spammer, that's why I don't have Molt Augmented on. With this setup, I would recommend running Nautilus with Cordon to pull enemies in, as you can stack up Inferno drastically, and the heat procs being applied from the spells will proc to nearby enemies as well, creating a nice little bonfire. I would also recommend getting your hands on the Epitaph and putting Viral on it. Spamming the Epitaph to enemies as you cast Inferno will apply Viral on them, thus increasing your heat damage over time. This allows you to delete groups of enemies, and the cherry on top is you have armor stripping from your 3rd ability, allowing you to shred enemies even more. Because remember, heat damage over time is affected by enemies' armor. It's not like Slash, which ignores the armor. In order for heat to do a lot of damage over time, you have to armor strip them. This is my go-to setup for Ember. Moving on to the weapons platform build for Ember. This focuses purely on weapons. We make use of Fireball Frenzy, so we add extra heat damage onto our weapons. I have left the subsume open, but you can subsume your 4th ability here with any of the damage boosting abilities, whether that's Raw, Zartus Whisper, Eclipse, or Nourish. So this is entirely up to you. This is up to your personal preference and what you find gives you more damage, or maybe depending on the weapons and synergies that you want to use. Here is what the build would look like. This is if you want to make use of the damage boost that you get from Fireball Frenzy for your weapons, and of course boosting the damage even further from the helmet. It's a nice little setup. We now move on to the last setup for this video. This is the ultimate tank setup, suggested to me by a viewer on stream. I did not expect this to work so well, but it did. Basically, this playstyle is for those of you who just don't want to die at all and just want to focus solely on your weapons. If you are facing enemies that are literally level 500, maybe a little bit higher, and below that, you can pretty much just face tank them and just not care. So how do we achieve this level of tankiness with Ember? Well, we will make use of her Immolation's damage reduction, which will be 90%. We will subsume Eclipse onto our 1st ability, and we will make use of the damage reduction side of this ability, which is Lunar Eclipse. Adaptation on our build, Primed Redirection for more shield scaling, because we will be making use of Arcane Aegis, because the more damage dealt to shields, the higher chance of Arcane Aegis to proc. And enemies do so little damage to our shields that Arcane Aegis will proc a lot more, meaning even if they do eventually get our shields down with all the damage reduction, it will just proc Aegis again, which will bring you straight up to max shields. It is disgusting. To make it even more overkill, we use Brief Respite, and then we can make use of Exothermic for more energy sustain. The only downside of this build is Toxin. That is its biggest weakness. Other than that, it's pretty much impossible for you to die. This is what the build looks like here. When you play the setup, all you do is get your Immolation up to 90%, cast Lunar Eclipse, proceed to fall asleep because nothing will kill you in base steelpath. This is a really great setup for those of you who just simply don't want to think much and enjoy the gaming, especially if you are playing a solo mission. Now that pretty much concludes all of Ember's builds for you. Like I said in the beginning, she is super versatile, so please feel free to change out the builds to your liking. When it comes to Archon shards, casting speed shards are the way. For Ember, 2 to 3 in my opinion, because she has terrible casting speed on her 4th ability, strength shards or duration shards if you want to, and alternatively, if you want to drop flow on your builds to free up a mod slot, you can do that and you can run 2 blue shards for energy. For my final thoughts on Ember, is she a good frame after her little rework? Absolutely, I think she is definitely in a better place. Do I think more people should play her? It depends on what you're looking for in a frame. If you like a nuke or a frame that can do a hybrid playstyle, and maybe you like a lot of heat damage, or that type of vibe, then Ember is a perfect option for you. If you are wondering, is she worth the form investment? Yes. Plus, the heirloom skin is a bonus too. I mean, we knew what DE was doing here. The only downside with her is having to manage the heat bar from Imulation. However, the more you play with her, the more you practice, you'll find that it will become second nature and you don't really have to worry too much about that. You will not regret building this frame. I am pleasantly surprised. She is great. That's my final thoughts on Ember. Give her a try if you enjoy her. And thank you so much for watching this video, and a huge shout out to Stefan, Shakiro, Darwin, Gilbert, Ayrton Yard, Hythrax, Wonderbraid, Villa, and Oddity Racing for supporting the channel, and of course a huge shout out to all of the channel members as well. Thank you so much for your support. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I will see you all in the next one.